My head was pounding. I groaned, barely cracking my eyes open as daylight streamed through a crack in the hotel room curtains. My tongue felt like sandpaper, and my body ached in ways I didn't want to analyze. The faint scent of cologne and sex clung to the sheets, triggering an immediate panic in my sleep-addled brain. Oh no. I turned my head slowly, and sure enough, there was a man lying beside me, his broad, bare back facing me. The dim lighting did nothing to dull the sharp lines of his muscles, the faint bruises of my own making scattered across his skin. My stomach lurched. What the hell had I done last night? I scrambled upright, nearly toppling off the bed in the process. My clothes were a mess on the floor, my phone blinking ominously from the nightstand. I reached for it, my heart sinking as I saw the time. 8:42 a.m. Class started at 10. Shit, I whispered, hurriedly collecting my belongings. I needed to get out of here before he woke up. The last thing I wanted was an awkward morning after conversation. Or worse, having to explain why I'd blacked out in a stranger's bed. My memory of last night was a blur of neon lights, alcohol, and, oh God, grief. The breakup. That's what had pushed me into a bar, drowning my sorrows in overpriced whiskey. I had vague recollections of flirting, of a pair of piercing gray eyes watching me across the counter, of a deep voice asking if I wanted another drink. Clearly, I'd said yes. I yanked on my jeans and shoved my feet into my sneakers, my movements as quiet as possible. The man beside me shifted slightly, and I froze. After a long, heart-stopping moment, he didn't wake. I exhaled in relief and grabbed my shirt, barely managing to pull it on before slipping out of the hotel room. The hallway was mercifully empty. I hurried down to the lobby, ignoring the amused glance the receptionist gave me as I walked past. I must have looked like a complete mess, my hair tangled and my clothes wrinkled. But I didn't care. I was free, for now. By the time I made it back to my dorm, showered, and shoved my notes into my backpack, my headache had dulled to a mild throb. I popped 2 aspirin and chugged some water before rushing across campus. The lecture hall was already half full when I arrived, students chatting idly as they waited for class to start. I slid into a seat near the middle, grateful for the anonymity of the crowd. My goal was simple: survive the next 2 hours and pretend last night never happened. Then the door at the front of the room opened, and my stomach dropped. The man from the hotel walked in, dressed in a crisp button-up and dark slacks, looking every bit the professional authority figure he clearly was. No. He set his leather briefcase on the desk and turned to face the class, those same piercing gray eyes scanning the room. My blood turned to ice as they landed on me, recognition flickering in his gaze.
Good morning,
He said smoothly.
I'm Professor Zach Sinclair. I'll be your instructor for this course.
I wanted to die. I stared at him. He stared back. My entire body had gone stiff, hands gripping my notebook so tightly I thought the pages might tear. I was hallucinating, right? There was no way the man I had just snuck out on was standing at the front of my lecture hall introducing himself as my professor. But as the moments stretched and his sharp gaze flickered with something suspiciously close to amusement, I realized with horrifying certainty that I was not hallucinating. This was real, and I was screwed. I snapped my eyes away, slumping in my chair as heat crept up my neck. Maybe if I just sat very still, he'd forget I existed.
All right.
Zach, Professor Sinclair, oh God, continued, his voice steady.
This course will be an intensive overview of research methodologies and academic writing. I expect you to engage, participate, and
I risked a glance. He was looking directly at me.
to remain focused in class.
His lips twitched slightly, barely noticeable, but I caught it. That bastard was enjoying this. I quickly looked down, pretending to take notes even though I hadn't registered a single word. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my back. This couldn't be happening. I needed a plan. Damage control. I'd avoid eye contact, never speak in class, and definitely never acknowledge last night. Maybe he'd take the hint and pretend it never happened, too. Simple. I just had to survive the semester without dying of humiliation. The lecture dragged on. Every time Zach spoke, I felt like my entire body locked up. His voice was too familiar now, too smooth, too deep. I had heard it murmuring against my skin just hours ago. I felt like I was going to explode. When class finally ended, I bolted. I shoved my notebook into my bag and practically sprinted for the door. If I could just disappear before he...
Alex.
I froze mid-step. My stomach twisted as the voice I was desperately trying to escape called my name. Students brushed past me, filtering out of the room, oblivious to the internal breakdown I was having. Slowly, I turned. Zach was leaning against his desk, arms crossed, looking infuriatingly relaxed.
Come here for a second,
He said, voice too casual for someone who had just found their one-night stand in their classroom. I swallowed hard, glancing around. A few students were still lingering, but nobody was paying attention. If I ignored him, I'd only make it worse. Forcing my legs to move, I approached, stopping a cautious few feet away. Yes, Professor? I asked, voice strained. He raised an eyebrow. Professor? Really?
I didn't take you for the type to run off in the morning.
I almost choked on air. Keep your voice down. I hissed, panic shooting through me. I darted a glance around, but no one seemed to have caught that. Thank God. Zach smirked.
Relax. I'm not about to announce it to the whole department.
My mouth opened, then closed. What was I supposed to say? Sorry for sneaking out? Sorry for not realizing you were my professor before jumping into bed with you? Sorry for existing? Zach watched me struggle, clearly entertained.
So,
He said, his tone dangerously amused.
are you going to pretend it never happened?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. His smirk widened. I hated him.
I'd say we should talk about it.
He mused, tilting his head slightly.
But you seemed pretty eager to escape earlier.
I groaned, covering my face with my hands. This cannot be happening,
It is.
he said, sounding way too pleased with himself.
And I think we need to set some ground rules.
I peeked at him between my fingers. Ground rules?
You're my student. I'm your professor. Whatever happened before today stays in the past.
His expression was calm now, professional.
Understood.
I nodded so fast I probably looked ridiculous. Yes, of course. Definitely. He studied me for a second longer, then gave a satisfied nod.
Good.
Crisis averted. But just as I turned to flee the conversation, Zach spoke again, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down my spine.
For the record, though,
I stopped breathing.
last night, that was fun.
I sprinted out of the room. Avoiding Zach Sinclair turned out to be impossible. I had convinced myself that as long as I kept my head down and stayed quiet, things would settle into a normal, not completely humiliating routine. I'd go to class, pretend nothing happened, and ignore the fact that my professor had literally seen me naked. Easy, right? Wrong. Because he wouldn't stop looking at me. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. But as the days passed, I became painfully aware of his gaze. Quick glances during lectures, the occasional smirk when he called on me, the way his fingers tapped against the desk as if he were holding back from saying something inappropriate. And worst of all, the way my traitorous body reacted to it. I had zero excuse for why I still remembered how his hands felt on me, or why my stomach flipped every time he said my name. This was a problem. A very, very big problem. The real disaster struck the following week. I had just settled into my usual seat when Zach casually dropped a bomb on the class.
I'll be selecting a research assistant for this semester.
He announced, scanning the room.
It's an opportunity to gain experience in academic writing and publishing. If you're interested, submit your applications by the end of the week.
The room buzzed with excitement. Research assistantships were a big deal. They looked great on CVs and gave students direct access to professors' projects. I, however, was frozen in my seat, because I had already applied. Before I had even met Zach Sinclair, before our disastrous one-night stand, I had submitted my application for this exact position. It was a perfect stepping stone for my thesis work, and I had been so confident in my chances. Now I wanted to crawl into a hole and die. The second class ended. I rushed to his desk, waiting for the last few students to clear out before lowering my voice. About the research assistant position, I started hesitantly. Zach leaned back against the desk, arms crossed, looking far too amused for my liking.
Yes.
I licked my lips, suddenly nervous. I already applied. Before everything. His eyebrow arched slightly. I just thought I should mention it, I added quickly. I don't expect special treatment or anything. If you want to withdraw my application, I totally understand.
Why would I do that?
Zach interrupted, his voice calm. I blinked. Because of, he smirked.
Because of the fact that you ran out of my bed like I was about to murder you?
My soul left my body. Oh my God. Keep your voice down. I hissed, darting a glance around. Zach chuckled, clearly enjoying my suffering.
Relax, Alex. I don't mix personal and professional matters.
I narrowed my eyes. You don't. His smirk deepened.
No. Which means if you're the best candidate, you'll get the position. No bias.
My brain short-circuited. Was he serious? I studied his face, trying to find any hint of sarcasm, but he looked completely genuine.
Unless,
Zach added, his voice dropping slightly,
you're saying you can't handle working with me.
oh, this asshole. I straightened my spine, ignoring the way my pulse spiked. I can handle it. Zach's eyes gleamed with something dangerous.
Good.
He murmured, voice far too smooth.
Then I look forward to seeing what you bring to the table, Mr. Gomez.
I turned and walked away before he could see the blush creeping up my neck. I was so screwed. By some twisted stroke of fate, I was selected as Zach Sinclair's research assistant. I had no idea if I was genuinely the best candidate or if this was some kind of cosmic punishment for my past sins. But either way, I was stuck. And it was absolute hell. Not because the work was hard. I could handle the workload just fine. It was him, Zach, Professor Sinclair. The man I was now forced to spend hours alone with every week in his office, pretending that he hadn't once pinned me against a mattress and wrecked me. And the worst part? He acted like it wasn't a big deal at all. Meanwhile, I was sitting across from him, trying not to combust every time he leaned in to point something out on my laptop screen, or rolled up his sleeves, or spoke in that damn voice that I now associated with things that were very much not academic. It was a nightmare. A very attractive, well-dressed, broad-shouldered nightmare. One afternoon, I was holed up in his office, sifting through research articles while Zach typed away at his desk. The room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of papers shuffling or fingers tapping against the keyboard. I was doing fine, totally fine, until Zach spoke.
You're tense.
I almost dropped my pen. What? He smirked, leaning back in his chair.
You've been fidgeting for the past 10 minutes.
I stiffened. I'm just focused. Zach hummed, unconvinced.
You sure?
I gritted my teeth. What was his deal? He was the one who said we had to be professional. And yet he kept pulling this shit. I'm fine, I muttered, staring at my notes with great intensity. There was a pause, then the sound of Zach's chair rolling back. I refused to look up, but I knew he was moving closer. A moment later, he was standing behind me, my entire body locked up.
Your posture is awful,
he said, and before I could react, his hands landed on my shoulders. I froze.
Relax,
he murmured, pressing his thumbs lightly against my tense muscles.
You're too stiff.
That was because my professor was touching me. But did I tell him to stop? No, because the second his fingers began kneading slow, firm circles into my shoulders, a traitorous shiver ran down my spine. I was going to die. Right here. Right now.
You need to take breaks.
Zach continued, voice calm, like he wasn't casually ruining my life.
Staring at a screen too long isn't good for you.
I made a noise that was supposed to be normal but came out weirdly breathy. Zach paused, and then I felt it, the slow brush of his thumb against the back of my neck. Oh, this was not professional. I swallowed hard. I should get back to work. Zach hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling away, his touch lingering just a little too long.
Of course,
he said smoothly, like he hadn't just set me on fire. I exhaled shakily, staring at my laptop screen without actually reading a single word. This was bad. Very, very bad. Because no matter how much I told myself that this was just a job and Zach was just my professor, I couldn't ignore the fact that when he touched me, I didn't want him to stop. The problem with denial is that eventually, reality slaps you in the face. And my reality? I was attracted to Zach Sinclair. Very attracted. Which was a problem because not only was he my professor, but he was also my boss. I spent the next few days convincing myself that the whole shoulder massage thing had been a fluke. That Zach was just being, overly familiar. That it didn't mean anything. And if I repeated that enough times, maybe I'd start believing it. That illusion shattered by Friday night. It was late, and I was the only one left in Zach's office, finishing up some data entry while he graded papers. The air felt different. Maybe it was because we were alone after hours. Maybe it was because the office lights were dimmer than usual. Maybe it was because I was too aware of the way Zach occasionally glanced at me over his laptop, like he was thinking something he shouldn't be thinking. I kept my head down and powered through the work, until Zach's voice broke the silence.
You should call it a night, Alex.
I didn't look up. Almost done. A pause. Then,
You always push yourself this hard.
I hesitated, then sighed. I have to. Zach leaned back in his chair.
Why?
I finally met his gaze, finding genuine curiosity in his expression. Because I can't afford to slack off. His brows lifted slightly.
You're already one of the best students in this program. What are you so afraid of?
I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Because for a split second, I heard someone else's voice.
You're exhausting, Alex.
A familiar ache spread through my chest.
I can't do this anymore. I feel like I'm dating your ambition, not you.
The memory hit hard and fast. The way my ex had looked at me that night, frustration written all over his face.
Do you even know how to slow down? To just be with someone without constantly thinking about what's next? Because I don't think you do.
I had stood there, speechless, as he walked away, and I hadn't stopped him, because maybe he had been right. I swallowed hard and looked away. It's not that simple. Zach studied me for a long moment, his sharp gaze too piercing, too knowing.
You are good enough, Alex.
He said quietly.
You don't have to keep proving it to everyone.
My chest tightened, because I didn't know how to do that. And I sure as hell didn't know why Zach's words got to me the way they did. I exhaled, trying to shake it off. You sound like a therapist. Zach smirked.
You couldn't afford me if I were.
I let out a soft, surprised laugh before I could stop myself. And for a second, the tension in my body eased. But then Zach stood up. My pulse spiked as he rounded the desk, coming to lean against it. Right next to me. He was close. Too close. I could smell his cologne, clean and subtle, and it triggered a very dangerous memory of that night. I needed to get out of here. I grabbed my bag and stood abruptly. I should go. But as I moved to step past him, Zach's hand caught my wrist. My breath hitched. I looked up at him, my pulse hammering. Big mistake. Because his eyes were dark, intent, like he was thinking about something just as reckless as I was. Seconds stretched between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The air crackled. This is a bad idea. And then, his thumb brushed against the inside of my wrist, slow and deliberate. I felt that touch everywhere. I sucked in a sharp breath. Zach! He let go. Just like that. The moment shattered. I stumbled back a step, my heart racing, my skin still burning where he had touched me. Zach's expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight.
Go home, Alex.
I hesitated, then turned and walked out the door, because if I had stayed a second longer, I might not have been able to stop myself. I was going insane. That was the only explanation, because for the next week, every time I stepped into Zach Sinclair's classroom, all I could think about was that moment. The way his fingers had brushed against my wrist. The way he had looked at me, like he was barely holding himself back. And the worst part? I didn't want him to hold back. I wanted to see how far we could push this before it snapped. Which was dangerous. Friday afternoon, I sat in Zach's office, reviewing some data for a project. I told myself I wasn't avoiding eye contact with him, that my heart wasn't pounding every time he leaned over my desk to check something on my laptop, that I wasn't hyper-aware of his cologne, or the way his sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, or the fact that I knew exactly what he looked like without a shirt on. Denial was a beautiful thing.
So,
Zach said, leaning back in his chair, his gaze locked on me.
any plans this weekend?
I shrugged, forcing myself to focus on the screen. Nothing exciting.
Still avoiding dating?
My fingers froze on the keyboard. I looked up slowly, narrowing my eyes. That's none of your business. Zach smirked, tilting his head.
I'm just curious. You strike me as someone who doesn't let go easily.
I exhaled through my nose, willing myself to stay calm. And you strike me as someone who asks too many questions.
Guilty.
His smirk deepened.
But you didn't answer.
I clicked my pen against the desk, debating whether or not to tell him the truth. Then, before I could stop myself, I said, my ex dumped me because I was too focused on my career. Zach's expression shifted. Still amused, but with something else behind it. Curiosity, interest, maybe even understanding.
Sounds like they couldn't keep up.
He said. I snorted. That's one way to put it. Zach watched me for a long moment, like he was trying to figure me out. Then, to my complete horror, he said,
Was I better?
I choked. Excuse me? He grinned.
I mean, you had a basis for comparison.
Oh, my God. I felt my face ignite. That is so inappropriate. Zach shrugged, completely unbothered.
Technically, you started it.
I gaped at him. I did not.
You just admitted to thinking about me in comparison to your ex.
I wanted to die. I grabbed a file from the desk and smacked him with it. Zach just laughed. Laughed. The worst part? It was a good laugh. Deep and warm and genuinely amused. I hated how much I liked it. The tension between us didn't ease after that. If anything, it got worse. Every time he walked past me, I was hyper-aware of the way his fingers would barely skim my shoulder. Every time I looked up, he was already watching me. Every time we talked, there was something unspoken between us. And the line we were towing, it was getting dangerously thin. That Friday evening, I finished up my work and gathered my things, determined to ignore the way Zach was still watching me. But as I reached for the door, he spoke.
Alex.
I turned, my stomach doing that stupid, anticipatory flip. Zach's expression was unreadable, but his voice was low when he said,
If I weren't your professor, would you want me?
My breath hitched. The air in the room felt too thick, too charged. I swallowed, my throat dry. That's not a fair question. His lips curled slightly.
I know.
Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I realized I wasn't the only one struggling to pretend this wasn't happening. I should have walked out of that office. I should have ignored the way Zach was looking at me, like he already knew my answer, like he already knew that, despite all my protests, I wanted him. But instead, I made the worst possible choice. I stayed. I closed the door. A stupid, reckless decision. Zach didn't move. He just watched me, his expression calm, but his eyes burned.
You didn't answer my question,
he said. My heart pounded. And you shouldn't have asked it. Zach stood, slow and deliberate, rounding the desk until he was in front of me. I didn't step back. I should have, but I didn't. His gaze flickered over my face, his voice lower now, darker.
But if I weren't your professor, you would, wouldn't you?
I swallowed hard. This is a bad idea. He exhaled, the breath warm against my skin.
The worst.
Then why weren't we stopping? The air between us crackled. I could feel the heat radiating from him, smell his cologne, clean, sharp, mixed with something distinctly him. My fingers curled at my sides. He was so close, too close. Zach reached up, his hand brushing against my jaw, fingertips barely skimming my skin. I sucked in a breath, every muscle in my body tensed. This was dangerous. This was stupid. And I wanted it anyway.
Tell me to stop.
Zach murmured. I didn't. His thumb traced along my cheekbone. Featherlight.
You're shaking.
I hated how much he noticed. I'm not. I lied. His lips curved.
You are.
Zach tilted my chin up slightly, forcing me to meet his gaze.
I don't mix personal and professional,
He said. I let out a breathless, bitter laugh. Neither do I. His eyes flickered to my mouth.
Then tell me why you're still here.
Couldn't. I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to say it out loud. Because if I did, if I admitted that I wanted him, then there was no taking it back. Zach must have seen it in my expression, because his grip on my chin tightened slightly. And then, finally, he kissed me. Zach's lips pressed against mine, firm, demanding. Like he had waited too long for this. Like he was done pretending. I should have pushed him away. I should have reminded him of the rules. But instead, my fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. His hands slid to the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair as he deepened the kiss. I melted. Every thought of caution, every reason why this was a bad idea, gone. All that mattered was the way his mouth moved against mine, slow but deliberate, like he was savoring every second. I gasped when his teeth grazed my bottom lip, and Zach took full advantage, his tongue sliding against mine, teasing, devouring. I felt his smirk even as he kissed me. Cocky bastard. But then he pressed me against the door, his body flush against mine, and I stopped caring. I could feel everything. The way his hands roamed my waist, how warm his skin was through his shirt, how his breath came a little heavier when I gripped his shoulder. We were past the point of no return. I knew it, and I didn't care. Zach's lips left mine, trailing along my jaw, down my throat. I tilted my head back, exhaling sharply as his teeth scraped against my skin, right where my pulse pounded. Zach! My voice was barely a whisper.
Mm.
His hands slid under my sweater, palms warm against my bare skin. Lock the door, I breathed. His head lifted slightly, amusement flickering through his eyes.
No turning back.
I grabbed his tie, yanking him back down. Not a chance. I should have felt guilty. I should have been panicking. Instead, I was lying on Zach's office couch, completely spent, my sweater half off, my heart still racing. My brain was trying to remind me of all the reasons this was a bad idea. Professor, student, career suicide. But none of that mattered when Zach Sinclair was looking at me like that. Like he'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Like he wasn't even remotely sorry. Stop staring? I muttered, pressing a hand over my face. Zach chuckled, low and satisfied.
You weren't complaining 10 minutes ago.
I groaned. I need to go. He hummed, completely relaxed.
You could stay.
I turned my head to glare at him. You're insane, I said. We literally just broke every professional boundary in existence. Zach tilted his head.
Not every boundary.
I threw a pillow at him. He caught it easily, laughing. Smug. Too smug. I sat up, running a hand through my mess of hair. This never happened. Zach raised an eyebrow.
You sure about that? I wasn't. Not even a little. Because my skin still burned where he had touched me. Because my lips were still swollen from his kisses. Because I had never felt like this before. I exhaled sharply. We can't do this again. Zach didn't argue. He just leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a kiss so soft, so slow, it made my stomach drop. And then, against my mouth, he murmured, "Liar." I knew something was wrong the second I stepped into class. The whispers, the sideways glances, the way some students straight up turned in their seats to look at me. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I slid into my usual spot, trying to ignore it, but Ethan, who had saved me a seat, was already staring.
Dude,
He whispered, leaning in.
you're in deep shit.
My stomach clenched. What? Ethan shoved his phone under my nose, and my blood ran cold. A blurry photo. Me, Zach, together. It wasn't explicit. Just the two of us standing close, talking. But it was enough. Enough to look like something. Enough to start rumors. The caption underneath? Professor Sinclair getting cozy with a student? I swore under my breath. Where did this come from? Ethan scrolled.
Some anonymous account. It's blowing up in the student forum.
My pulse pounded. This wasn't just some stupid gossip. If the wrong people saw this, if the faculty caught wind of it, Zach could lose everything. I barely heard the start of class. I was too busy keeping my head down, pretending I wasn't being watched. And Zach? He was unbothered. Like he hadn't seen the damn photo. Like he wasn't at the center of a brewing scandal. His calmness just made me panic more. The moment class ended, I bolted. Straight to his office. Straight into danger. The second I closed the door behind me, I turned to Zach, heart hammering. We have a problem. Zach barely looked up from his desk.
I saw.
I gaped at him. That's all you have to say? He set his pen down, finally meeting my gaze.
What do you want me to say, Alex?
I ran a hand through my hair, pacing. I don't know. Maybe something like, holy shit, this could ruin everything? Zach sighed, standing up and walking toward me.
Calm down.
Calm down? Zach, if this gets out. He was right in front of me now. Too close.
And if it does?
He asked, voice steady.
What's the worst that happens?
I stared at him. You get fired. He held my gaze.
And if I do, so be it.
My stomach twisted. Zach.
I don't regret this.
He said, quiet but firm. My breath caught. His fingers brushed against mine. Subtle, fleeting, but enough to send heat curling through me.
I knew what I was doing when I kissed you.
He murmured. I swallowed hard. This isn't just about us anymore. Zach exhaled.
I know.
Silence stretched between us. I should have walked away. I should have put distance between us. But instead, I stayed. Instead, my fingers curled around his. Because no matter how risky this was, I wasn't ready to let him go. The whispers didn't stop. I felt them in the hallways, in the library, in the way people looked at me in class, like they were trying to decide if the rumors were true. And maybe they were. A blurry photo, a few speculative comments on social media, and suddenly Professor Sinclair and I were the department's hottest scandal. It didn't matter that we weren't doing anything inappropriate. It didn't matter that we weren't even together, at least not in the way people assumed. But it was enough to make my stomach twist every time I stepped onto campus. It was enough to make me want to run. I wasn't sure why I ended up outside his apartment. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the fact that I had been trying to avoid him all week, and all it had done was make me feel worse. Maybe it was because, despite everything, I wanted to see him. When Zach opened the door, he didn't look surprised. He simply stepped aside.
Come in.
I walked in, the door clicking shut behind me. The place was quiet, warm, a far cry from the dimly lit hotel room where this all started. There were books stacked on the coffee table, a jacket draped over the back of the couch. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. Lived in but not messy. Zach leaned against the armrest of his couch, watching me.
You look like you're about to say something.
I took a breath. The rumors aren't going away.
I know.
I hesitated. And you're not worried? Zach tilted his head.
Should I be?
I blinked at him. Zach. He pushed off the couch, stepping closer.
You think I regret this?
I swallowed. Don't you? His gaze softened.
Alex.
And just like that, all the tension, all the panic, all the overthinking crashed down at once. I let out a shaky breath. I don't know what I'm doing.
That makes two of us.
I let out a weak laugh. Not exactly reassuring, Professor. That made him smile.
Then let me be clear.
He reached out, fingertips brushing against mine.
I don't regret this. I don't regret you.
I exhaled sharply, because that scared me more than the rumors. More than anything. Because I didn't just want him. I wanted this. And for the first time, I let myself admit it. So when Zach pulled me in, when his lips met mine, slow, deliberate, certain, I stopped running. We barely made it to the bedroom. This time, there was no alcohol. No heartbreak clouding my judgment. Just us. His hands steady against my skin. My breath, uneven as his lips traced down my jaw. Every touch a promise. When we finally collapsed together, tangled in the quiet of his apartment, I realized I was smiling. Zach noticed.
What?
I shook my head. Nothing. His fingers skimmed my waist, lazy and warm.
You're not thinking about the rumors?
I hesitated before admitting, not right now. His lips brushed against my forehead.
Then let's stay like this a little longer.
And for once, I didn't want to be anywhere else.